Ever feel stuck? Like something's holding you back from, being your best self?
Oh, absolutely. That feeling's universal.
It is, right. And you wouldn't think it, but even folks back in the 13th century felt that same way.
It's true. And we know this thanks to sources like the sermons of Raoul Ardent,
Raoul Ardent. Now, he was a French preacher.
who had this incredible way
Yeah.
of taking biblical stories
Yeah.
and making them resonate with the everyday struggles of medieval life.
And that's what we're diving into today.
Really digging into Ardent's work. And what strikes me is he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. Like he uses the story of Peter's imprisonment.
Right, Peter in chains.
Exactly. To talk about that universal feeling of being trapped, but trapped by our own bad habits. Or as he calls it, the prison of sin.
Ooh, I like that. The prison of sin. So there's Ardent's sermon, right? And something about it really jumped out at me, the word squads.
Oh, yes.
He uses squads to describe temptations, like it's so specific. 4 squads, he says, guarding the prisoner of sin, each with these sneaky tactics.
It really is such vivid imagery.
It is. It's like spiritual boot camp, but the enemy is our own weaknesses.
And he gets to this crucial point about how people in the Middle Ages really viewed temptation, right? This wasn't just some random thought you brush aside.
Right.
They saw these temptations as organized forces, like actual squads, working to, lead you astray.
So he's not letting us off easy by saying, oh, it's just a little temptation. He's like, no, these are serious forces at work here.
Yep.
And he names these squads shame, false security, obstinacy, and unbelief. Then he even breaks them down further, right?
Oh, yeah.
Each squad with 4 sub-temptations.
It's like he's created this whole taxonomy of temptation.
He has, and it's fascinating. Like, under shame, for instance, he lists things like the shame of confessing.
Which might seem odd at first,
It does.
but then you think about the context.
Okay, right, because we think confessing, that's a good thing.
It is, but remember, this is a world deeply intertwined with religion, with social hierarchy. Confession, it wasn't just between you and God. It was a public act.
Oh, wow. So you're confessing in front of everybody.
Often, yeah. And you're carrying that anxiety about judgment, not just from, the church itself, but from your community too.
So Arden is tapping into a very real fear for these people.
Exactly. He's not talking in hypotheticals. He's addressing this very real pressure his listeners are facing internally and externally.
And that makes it so relatable even now, centuries later.
Absolutely. He takes these abstract ideas like sin, temptation, and makes them tangible, real.
So instead of his listeners feeling alone, he's like, hey, I get it. This is hard.
Exactly. We're all in this together.
He's right there with them, guiding them.
And that's key, right? It's not just about identifying the problem, it's about finding the solution. And he actually does that. Ardent doesn't just describe Peter's escape from prison. He maps out a guide for everyone listening.
So he's giving them a way out.
Yeah, a step-by-step for how they can break free from their own personal prisons, the prison of sin.
I like that he's giving practical advice.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it's rooted in the biblical text, which is clever. He ties Peter's actual physical actions in the story to spiritual transformation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
All right, so when the angel tells Peter to get dressed, right, put his sandals on, cloak, the whole bit, Ardent takes that and runs with it.
Instead of just a detail, it
It's
becomes
a metaphor. It becomes this call to action for everyone listening. So like girding yourself, that becomes self-control. Putting on your shoes, that's about avoiding earthly desires.
And clothing yourself.
Putting on virtue.
It's like he's saying getting dressed for your soul is just as important as getting dressed for the day.
That's a great way to put it.
Oh.
But you bring up a good point, right? Peter had help. Divine intervention. An angel busts him out. Where does that fit into Ardent's whole escape plan?
Because it can't all be about, like, willpower.
Right.
Right?
No, and Ardent wouldn't say it is. He's very clear. We need help.
Mm-hmm.
He compares that angel to the voice of conscience, maybe even a preacher.
Yeah.
Someone to guide us toward repenting,
Yeah.
right, and to offer support. But he takes it a step further, connecting this to prayer. Remember all those people praying for Peter while he's locked up?
Yeah, they don't just forget about him.
Right. And Ardent is reminding his listeners that prayer, it's not just a personal plea for help. It's an act of love, of support, communal. He even compares those who don't pray for others to Ham.
Him.
Yeah, Noah's son from the story of the ark.
Yeah.
The one who mocked his own father instead of, covering him up.
Oh, right.
It's a strong image.
Right.
And it really drives home that responsibility we have to help each other. And for Ardent, prayer is a big part of that.
But even with all that divine intervention, people praying for you, Ardent doesn't shy away from the fact that there are still obstacles. He talks about this Iron Gate.
The Iron Gate, yeah.
What's that about? What's he getting at there?
He's acknowledging that some things are just harder to break free from. It's that feeling of, here we go again,
Yeah.
like you're hitting a wall. The Iron Gate, for him, represents those deep-seated habits, the ones that feel impossible to break.
Because we've all been there. That voice that says you'll never change, or you try so many times to get rid of a bad habit, you just feel resigned.
Exactly. That's the Iron Gate Arden's talking about.
It's like he's saying those habits, they're like a heavy door slamming shut, keeping us stuck.
A very powerful image. But like you said, Arden doesn't leave us there. He doesn't just say, oh, it's hard, too bad. He offers hope.
So how do we chip away at those, what did he call them?
Iron Gates.
Right, those iron gates. How do we unlock them?
He goes back to prayer, that persistent, heartfelt prayer. But it's more than just going through the motions, It's about having that real, raw conversation with God.
Admitting our weaknesses.
Exactly. Asking for the strength to change, which, let's be honest, that's not always easy.
Oh, tell me about it. Sometimes it's hard to even admit that to yourself, let alone.
For God, right?
Yeah.
But there's freedom in that surrender. And it ties back to that idea of not being alone, right? We have our community. We have these wise voices like Ardent guiding us. And we have that direct line to God through prayer.
It reminds me actually of something else he talks about. It's in another sermon, the one on Peter's confession of faith.
You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, right?
That's the one. But Ardent, he makes this whole point of highlighting where this confession takes place, Caesarea Philippi. And I've always wondered, why is the location such a big deal?
Because it wasn't random. See, Caesarea Philippi, back then, it was this place known for these shrines. Shrines dedicated to rulers, past rulers. And people would go there to offer, tributes, gold, silver, precious stuff.
Okay, so a place of like outward displays of devotion.
Exactly. And Ardent uses that to show the contrast, right, between those empty gestures and the true confession Jesus is looking for.
So it's not enough to just say the words.
It's about what those words mean for how you live. What are you willing to give up? What's the cost of that confession?
That's a good way to put it. He wants us to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak.
And he calls out hypocrisy wherever he sees it. There's this one part where he compares people who brag about their faith but don't live it out to monkeys.
Monkeys.
Monkeys. He says they're like monkeys who are totally smitten with their babies, even though, as he puts it, the babies are even uglier than the monkeys themselves.
Okay, I can just picture that. And it's kind of funny, but also, ouch. I think we all know someone like that. Maybe we've even been that monkey ourselves a time or two.
Definitely been there. But it's a good reminder to check ourselves. And speaking of checking ourselves, there's another interesting thing Ardent does with this confession scene.
What's that?
So Jesus, right, he asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? But he starts by asking them, what are other people saying?
So he's asking them about other people's opinions before he asks for theirs. What's the lesson there?
I think Ardent's pointing out how important it is to really examine ourselves, even if it means hearing stuff we don't like, because we can be blind to our own flaws.
Oh, 100%. It's easy to surround yourself with yes people.
Exactly. And Ardent's saying, no, seek out the friends, the mentors who will tell you the truth, even when it's hard to hear.
It's like, do I have spinach in my teeth, but for your soul?
Exactly. But at the same time, I think he's also warning against just blindly following what everyone else says.
Because popular opinion isn't always right.
Exactly. He uses those different opinions about Jesus that were going around. Some people said he was John the Baptist, others Elijah.
Yeah, people were trying to figure him out.
And Ardent's point is, it's easy to get caught up in that, in what everyone else thinks. Especially now, right? It's like
social media is one big echo chamber sometimes.
It can be. So Ardent's message is super relevant. He's reminding us to be grounded, to think for ourselves.
To be discerning.
Exactly.
So I've got all these opinions flying around, but what about Peter? I mean, he cuts through it all with his answer. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Why does that resonate so strongly with Ardent?
Because it shows a deep understanding from Peter. It's not just that he gets it right, that he says the correct words. It's what he includes in that declaration. Like Ardent points out, he lists several truths about Jesus there, that he's the Christ, that he's the Son of God, and that God is a living God.
Not just some distant deity.
Exactly. And Ardent's point is, Peter, he gets it. He sees the bigger picture. But here's the thing. Ardent doesn't think Peter arrived at that understanding on his own.
What do you mean?
It wasn't just Peter thinking really hard or being super smart, right? Ardent argues that it was divine revelation, That moment where things just click, but it's not because of you. It's because of God's
Yeah,
grace.
aha moment.
Yes. And that's what makes Peter's confession so powerful for Ardent.
And of course, after this aha moment, this big revelation, we get this very famous scene. Jesus says to Peter, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And I have to ask, what do those keys actually represent?
It's one of those phrases that's just so loaded with imagery, right?
Right.
But luckily, Ardent unpacks it for us. He says the keys represent two things, discretion and power.
Discretion and power. So it's not just about having authority, it's about how you use it.
Exactly. Discretion for Ardent is knowing when to forgive, who to, and I'm using his words here, bind and loose. It's about understanding the weight of those decisions.
And the power part.
That's the ability to actually carry out those decisions,
Right.
to bind or loose. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, Ardent laments that a lot of priests in his time, they lacked one or the other. Either they didn't have that discretion or they abused their power.
He's calling out corruption in the church.
He is.
Yeah.
And this is the 13th century, so that's a pretty bold move.
It is.
But it shows just how much he cared about authority being used responsibly. And for Ardent, this wasn't just about, priests and bishops. It was about recognizing that we all have a responsibility to hold those in power accountable.
So what's the takeaway for the everyday person listening to this sermon back then?
Remember, for Ardent, true authority comes from God, not from like your social status or whatever.
Yeah.
So he's reminding people to trust their conscience, to call out hypocrisy when they see it, even when it's someone in a position of power.
He's saying don't check your brain at the door just because someone outranks you.
Exactly. You have a voice, you have a brain, use them.
Which is honestly a message that's still so relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. And it all goes back to what we've been talking about, right? That idea of discernment, cultivating that inner moral compass. That's how we use our authority responsibly, whatever authority means for us in our own lives.
Whether it's speaking up against injustice, making ethical choices, or even just, like you said, holding ourselves to the same standards we expect from others.
Perfectly said.
It's that idea of the iron gate, right? But instead of it being some external force, it's those internal things we put on ourselves, those fears, those limiting beliefs.
And what's so great about Arden is he gives us those tools to unlock that gate. Prayer, self-reflection, honest confession. He doesn't just point out the problem. He offers a way through.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, right? Because it's not just ancient history. These are struggles, fears, questions that are still so relevant.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a little something to ponder. What are those iron gates in your own life? What are those things holding you back? And how can you use those tools we talked about today, the prayer, the honesty, the discernment, to start unlocking your own path to freedom?
It's a journey, not a quick fix.
Definitely not. But as we've seen with Ardent's words, even centuries later, those steps he outlined, they can still light the way.